The History of the Harrietenberg and its Environs. Part 7. 2 Weddings and a War. Following the Battle of Fromage Bridge, the Grand Marshal Baron Spankowitz took upon himself the government of SOISSAGE and installed himself in the ducal palace. No one seemed to object to this to any great extent, and life in SOISSAGE went on much as before. A couple of weeks later, the Grand Marshal received a letter from the Countess Harriet von Harrietten, instructing him to return to Harrietten immediately. He did so, accompanied by Captain Galuska and the 1st Squadron of the Pink Hussars, and Colonel ROTZRAGGE and the 1st Company of Buttercups. The balance of the Army of Occupation remained in SOISSAGE, under the command of Colonel Toltot, who was appointed Governor of SOISSAGE in the Grand Marshal's absence. The Grand Marshal also took the Duc de SOISSAGE with him, placing him under the particular care of Colonel ROTZRAGGE. On arriving in Harrietten, the Grand Marshal immediately reported to Harrietten Castle. Upon this occasion he was not asked to wait in an antechamber. He was instead ushered straight into the presence of the Countess Harriet von Harrietten. The Grand Marshal advanced toward the Countess and bowed. The Countess did not extend her hand for him to kiss. "What exactly do you think you have been doing?" she asked. "Did you not receive my letter?" enquired the Grand Marshal. "Do you mean this piece of sentimental nonsense?" said the Countess, producing the Grand Marshal's letter and flourishing it in his general direction. "I do not expect the commander of my armies to write to me in the style of an overexcited schoolgirl of 15 summers. I ask again, what exactly do you think you are doing?" The Grand Marshal remained impassive. "In my letter," he replied, "I made a promise and a proposal." He slipped the ducal ring of SOISSAGE from his finger and tossed it at the Countess, who caught it. "I promised you SOISSAGE," he continued. "There it is, in your hand. Now, what do you say to my proposal?" The Countess rolled her eyes. "I suppose at least you have provided me with an engagement ring," she observed. "But is it worth having? Will the SOISSAGEois accept my rule?" The Grand Marshal laughed. "The SOISSAGEois are a cowardly and indolent lot," he said. "The only things that motivate them are their bellies and their sexual organs. They will be perfectly content with your rule, as long as you do not tax their brasseries or their bawdy houses." "And what about the Duke and the Duckling?" asked the Countess. "What about them?" replied the Grand Marshal. "The Duke is not a fighting man. He has many assets outside SOISSAGE which will very adequately support his lifestyle and furnish him with stake money for the card table. He poses no threat. I suggest you release him on condition that he does not return to SOISSAGE. As for the Duckling, I assume that he is safely in custody, where he belongs, and I suggest that he stays there." "Yes," said the Countess, "the Duckling is in prison, and he is lucky that I did not hang him like a dog." "Is that so?" enquired the Grand Marshal. "And why is that?" The Countess frowned. "I do not want to discuss the Duckling," she said. "Suffice it to say that some of the objects that were found in his possession, and that Lieutenant Blutwurst showed to me, opened my eyes." Her face brightened. "By the way," she added, "Lieutenant Blutwurst is a very dynamic and thrusting young man. He has pleased me greatly. You should promote him." The Grand Marshal agreed to promote Lieutenant Blutwurst at the first opportunity. "And I accept your proposal," said the Countess. We will have a public holiday to celebrate my great victory over SOISSAGE, and on that day we will also hold the ceremony to make you my consort. Consort, mind, you will take no other title. And then we will go to SOISSAGE, and I will be installed as Duchess. You are dismissed. Leave my presence." The Grand Marshal bowed and left. Meanwhile, Ulrich the Angry, the Emperor of the Petty States, had been extremely annoyed to hear of the fall of SOISSAGE, which left the armies of Harrietten poised on the borders of his northern homeland, as well as on the south-eastern flank of his empire. He immediately ordered Colonel Ritter and his solitary squadron of Krassenbachers, and Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus and the Countess' own guards, to DRECK. With them he sent his wife, the Countess Bettina von Schniffelstadt, who was with child, and a letter for Lieutenant Colonel Ragnar. Lieutenant Colonel Ragnar had been making effective use of his time in DRECK. He had raised a regiment of 2 squadrons of light cavalry, known as the DRECK Dragoons, and a regiment of line infantry. The Emperor's letter promoted Lieutenant Colonel Ragnar to full colonel, and confirmed him in command of this new line infantry regiment, which was henceforth known as Ragnar's regiment. It also appointed him as overall commander of all the forces of the Empire of the Petty States that were based in DRECK, and ordered him to immediately detach the DRECK Dragoons from that command and send them south to Schniffelstadt. It was also ordered that the DRECK Dragoons bring Colonel Laderstock with them. The Emperor did not want that gentleman anywhere near the Countess' own guards, or indeed the Krassenbachers. Having thus disposed his forces, the Emperor Ulrich waited on events. Eloise von Schniffelstadt was not one for waiting on events. On hearing of the fall of SOISSAGE, and learning from certain sources of the proposed military dispositions of the Emperor Ulrich, she had ridden to GREENMEAD with Colonel von Flussing, and the pair of them had met with the Honourable Mary Green, Lady of GREENMEAD, and Jack the Hat. "Mary," said Eloise von Schniffelstadt, "SOISSAGE has fallen. Ulrich the Angry is moving his forces north. Now is the time to strike, to retake what is rightfully mine. Will your armies march by my side?" The Honourable Mary Green was well aware of the fall of SOISSAGE. As a result, GREENMEAD was bounded to the north, east and south by lands controlled by Harrietten. She therefore did not consider that marching her armies to the west, as urged by her aunt, was a good idea. She informed her aunt of this. "You lack vision," snorted Eloise von Schniffelstadt. "I expected this. I will march anyway." Jack the Hat pointed out that Eloise von Schniffelstadt had been appointed as the governor of Tallinn, and that unilaterally invading Schniffelstadt was beyond the remit of that role. Eloise von Schniffelstadt turned to her niece. "Your milliner is impertinent," she said. The Lady of GREENMEAD replied that Tallinn was part of GREENMEAD, and GREENMEAD was not at war with the Emperor Ulrich, and had no desire to be. If her aunt marched into Schniffelstadt, the gates of Tallinn would be closed behind her. Colonel von Flussing then spoke. "My Empress," he said, "where you lead, the old boys will follow, but it will be difficult to single-handedly take on the combined forces of DRECK and Panini, especially as Panini now controls the forces of Negroni." "That is very true," said Eloise von Schniffelstadt. "But," she continued triumphantly, "we will not be single-handedly taking on the forces of DRECK and Panini. I do not think King Leonardo XIII of Panini will support Earl Ulrich the usurper against me when I will be fighting alongside the king's son?" "Why would the Crown Prince Leonardo fight alongside you?" asked Jack the Hat. "Well, my clever milliner," said Eloise von Schniffelstadt, "you see, there are some things that even you do not know. The Crown Prince Leonardo will be fighting alongside me because he has accepted my proposal of marriage." This announcement caused quite a stir. "It is quite unconventional for a lady to propose to a gentleman," observed the Lady of Greenmead, "and the gentlemen of Panini are renowned for being somewhat old-fashioned. I am surprised that the Crown Prince reacted favourably to such a brazen breach of etiquette." Jack the Hat snorted. "It would have frightened him out of his wits," he said. "He probably ran away and hid under a limber." Colonel von Flussing laughed. Eloise von Schniffelstadt turned and glared at him. "Colonel," she observed icily, "that is insubordination, and I will not tolerate it." She was at her most imposing and imperious, and Colonel von Flussing stammered a hasty apology. After all, if there was one thing that the colonel truly appreciated, it was the benefit of strict military discipline. Eloise von Schniffelstadt turned to her niece. "Crown Prince Leonardo is no fool," she said. "To be asked to marry a von Schniffelstadt is a rare honour indeed. Of course he reacted favourably." "I understand he's quite handsome," observed the Lady of Greenmead. "I do not know," her aunt replied. "I did not meet him. Our business was conducted by letter, and I do not care. He brings me artillery and men, and I understand he has been successful in ruling Negroni. He will be useful." "And do you think that you will make a good wife?" enquired the Honourable Mary Green. "After all, you are somewhat strong-willed." "You are asking the wrong question," replied Eloise von Schniffelstadt. "The question is not whether I will be a good wife, but whether he will make me a good husband. And yes, I believe that he can be adequately trained to that role." And so it was that several days later Eloise von Schniffelstadt rode out of Tolin, with Colonel von Flussing at her side and the old boys marching behind her. Thus began the nuptial war. Eloise von Schniffelstadt marched her men to Krassenbacher. She then issued a proclamation to the surrounding population, informing them that she was seeking recruits for the Krassenbacher regiment, and inviting those interested to report to the barracks of that regiment, where she had established her headquarters. When Emperor Ulrich heard that Eloise von Schniffelstadt had marched on Krassenbacher, his initial response was anger that the DRECK dragoons had not yet reached him. His anger changed to bemusement when he discovered that Eloise von Schniffelstadt's army consisted only of a regiment of line infantry. What could she possibly expect to achieve with such a diminutive force? But the ways of women had always been a mystery to him, and that woman in particular was a law unto herself. Whatever she thought she was playing at, this appeared to be a heaven-sent opportunity to remove her as a threat once and for all. He immediately marched the Earl's own regiment and both companies of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps eastwards towards Krassenbacher. Eloise von Schniffelstadt did not wait for him. She vacated Krassenbacher the day before his arrival and marched southwest towards Drabel. But over the couple of days she had been in Krassenbacher, a number of men had turned up at the barracks to enlist. Some of them were old hands who had decided to rejoin the colours, and others were young men who fancied some excitement. Thus, in addition to the old boys, she was now accompanied by half a squadron of Krassenbackers, although many of them were lamentably lacking even the rudiments of military drill. While these manoeuvres were taking place, Crown Prince Leonardo had not been idle. Leaving the king's skirmishers in Negroni, he had marched with Captain Ponzi's Purple Mountain Bersaglieri to Spongler, where he had augmented his force with the Negroni Grenadiers and the 2nd Battery of the king's artillery. He had then advanced to Drabble and then onward towards Krassenbacher. On the road between Drabble and Krassenbacher his army encountered and was united with that of Eloise von Schniffelstadt. And it was not just the two armies that were united. The same evening Eloise von Schniffelstadt and Crown Prince Leonardo, the Magister of Negroni, were married, with Colonel von Flussing and Colonel Ragionieri acting as witnesses. After the wedding, the happy couple called the officers of the combined army together for a staff meeting to discuss command structures, the logistical situation, and military strategy. The meeting extended into the early hours. How the newlyweds occupied themselves for the remainder of their wedding night, I do not know. The Emperor Ulrich had pursued Eloise von Schniffelstadt toward Drabble, but learning that the army of Negroni had joined her, he reversed direction. He fell back to Krassenbacher and then retreated further towards Schniffelstadt, followed closely by the combined armies of Eloise von Schniffelstadt and the Crown Prince Leonardo. In the meantime, the DRECK dragoons had arrived in Schniffelstadt to find fresh orders awaiting them. In accordance with these orders, Colonel Laderstock was confined to a prison cell, and the DRECK dragoons marched east, joining the Emperor Ulrich and his forces a couple of miles outside Schniffelstadt. At this point, at a small village named ROTZRAGGE, the Emperor Ulrich ceased his retreat, turned, and prepared to fight. ROTZRAGGE was surrounded by undulating farmland. Approaching it from the east, from Krassenbacher, the road passed between two such undulations. To the south stood Blister Hill, and a gently swelling eminence known as the Brock rose to the north. Beyond the Brock, the road passed to the south of an area of woodland known as Brock Wood. To the north of this wood rose the slopes of Loplug Hill. Opposite to Brock Wood, on the south side of the road, stood ROTZRAGGE Wood. Immediately to the west of these two areas of woodland reared ROTZRAGGE Ridge, running north to south across the line of the road. At this point, the road turned slightly to the left to pass through the few dwellings that made up the village of ROTZRAGGE, which was situated in a gap in ROTZRAGGE Ridge. The Emperor Ulrich deployed the Earl's Own Regiment in line immediately to the south of ROTZRAGGE, behind a hedgerow running up onto the southern part of ROTZRAGGE Ridge. Immediately to the right of the Earl's Own Regiment, he placed the 1st Company of the Dreckensbach Jaeger Corps. On the north side of the road, he situated the 2nd Company of the Dreckensbach Jaeger Corps behind the northern extension of ROTZRAGGE Ridge, which concealed them from anyone approaching along the Krassenbacher road. Finally, he placed a squadron of DRECK dragoons on each flank, the 1st Squadron on the right and the 2nd Squadron on the left. The combined army of Eloise von Schniffelstadt and Crown Prince Leonardo marched in column along the road. In the van, Captain Ponzi's Purple Mountain Bersaglieri screened the main body. Behind them marched the Negroni Grenadiers, followed by the 2nd Battery of the King's Artillery, under the personal command of Crown Prince Leonardo. Next came the Old Boys, with the small contingent of Krassenbackers riding in the rear. The Krassenbackers were under the command of Captain Schnabel, an experienced officer, who had previously served as a lieutenant in the Krassenbackers and had re-enlisted in response to Eloise von Schniffelstadt's call for men. As the Purple Mountain Bersaglieri marched into view, the Emperor Ulrich ordered his light troops forward onto ROTZRAGGE Ridge. On the right flank, the 1st Company of the DRECK Dragoons under Captain Romergrot advanced with the intention to round the south side of ROTZRAGGE Wood and take the enemy by surprise. On their left, the 1st Company of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps headed in column straight toward the same wood. On the left flank, the 2nd Company of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps ascended to the top of the ridge, where they formed a firing line covering the road. On the far left, the 2nd Squadron of the DRECK Dragoons advanced up and over the ridge, heading between Brock Wood and Lop Lug Hill. Not all of these troop movements were visible to Eloise von Schniffelstadt, but she had seen enough to order Colonel von Flussing to detach the 6th Company of the Old Boys and form a skirmish line to screen her southern flank from any attacking force emerging from ROTZRAGGE Wood. This was a wise move as, although she did not know it, the 1st Company of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps was now on the point of entering that very wood. Eloise von Schniffelstadt was also unaware that the 2nd Company of the DRECK Dragoons had now passed between Lop Lug Hill and Brock Wood and had reached the northwest slopes of the Brock, threatening her northern flank. The 1st Company of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps continued through ROTZRAGGE Wood to its eastern fringes, where they deployed into a skirmish line. Captain Rosenkerl of the 6th Company of the Old Boys ordered his men to advance towards this threat, and the two skirmish lines began to exchange fire. Meanwhile, the appearance of the 2nd Company of the DRECK Dragoons atop the Brock caused Eloise von Schniffelstadt considerable consternation. She ordered her husband to lead the 2nd Battery of the King's Artillery away from the road in a southerly direction, away from this threat, and detached Captain Schnabel's Krassenbachers to provide protection for the guns. Captain Rosenkerl was an impatient man. He was a blueman of the old school, and thought that fighting in skirmish line was an ineffective waste of time. After only a couple of minutes of doing so, he ordered his men to charge into the 1st Company of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps, and a confused melee ensued. Eloise von Schniffelstadt ordered Captain Ponzi's Purple Mountain Bersaglieri forward to engage the 2nd Company of the Dreckensbach Jägerkorps that she could see positioned on ROTZRAGGE Ridge. Captain Ponzi complied, but unlike Captain Rosenkerl, Captain Ponzi preferred to engage with the enemy at a safe distance and limited himself to an exchange of largely ineffective long-range fire. Colonel Raggianeri followed Captain Ponzi up the road, forming up the Negroni Grenadiers behind the thin purple line of Captain Ponzi's light infantry. Colonel von Flussing and the Old Boys also advanced up the road, ready to respond to any aggressive move by the DRECK Dragoons looking down on them from the Brock. As Crown Prince Leonardo moved his cannon southward, the 1st Squadron of the DRECK Dragoons, which was still situated on the crest of ROTZRAGGE Ridge, came into his sight. He immediately ordered his cannon to unlimber and fire on this target. The result was that Captain Romergrot and his men found copious 6-pound cannonballs bounding through their ranks. They withdrew, positioning ROTZRAGGE Wood between them and their tormentors. Crown Prince Leonardo was delighted by this result, and was keen to find a new target. Seeing that the advance of the Old Boys now provided him with a clear line of fire to the Brock, he traversed his guns and unleashed his barrage of death upon the 2nd Squadron of the DRECK Dragoons. The 2nd Squadron of the DRECK Dragoons was commanded by Captain Potet. He was a young, enthusiastic, dedicated officer. This did not prevent one of Crown Prince Leonardo's cannonballs from removing his head. This event, in addition to the other casualties that they were taking, encouraged the men of the 2nd Company of the DRECK Dragoons to withdraw, which they did, in some disarray, to shelter behind the Brock. Considerably shaken, they took no further part in the battle. Having run out of targets, Crown Prince Leonardo ordered his cannon to limber, with the intention of moving up to support the main body of the army. Meanwhile, the fighting between the 6th Company of the Old Boys and the 1st Company of the Dreckenbach Jägerkorps continued to ebb and flow, breaking down into a confused miscellany of individual combats, with neither side being able to gain the overall advantage. Although he had pulled his men back, Captain Romegrot was not a man to be disconcerted by artillery fire. He ordered his men to compose themselves, and, unlike their fellows in the 2nd Company, the 1st Company of the DRECK Dragoons did so. Having once more a coherent body of men under his command, Captain Romegrot considered how best to utilise them. Observing Captain Ponz's Purple Mountain Bersaglieri to the north of him, he ordered his men to charge along ROTZRAGGE Ridge and down into the flank of the Purple firing line. Focused on the 2nd Company of the Dreckenbach Jägerkorps in front of them, Captain Ponz's men did not notice the onrushing horde of green-clad dragoons until it was too late. What little fire they directed on the charging cavalry was thus tardy and inadequate to hold the horsemen at bay. The result was that the DRECK Dragoons cut the Purple Mountain Bersaglieri to pieces. As Crown Prince Leonardo and his cannon no longer appeared to require much protection, Captain Schnabel had turned his attention to the martial efforts of Captain Rosenkerl's men. Observing that they did not appear to be making any decisive progress, Captain Schnabel decided to lend them a hand and charged into the fray, where the Krassenbachers effectively used their swords on the 1st Company of the Dreckenbach Jägerkorps. When the main body of her army had advanced, Eloise von Schniffelstadt and her staff officers had not advanced with them. They remained, an isolated group, on the road some distance behind the Old Boys. Captain Romegrot, who was an observant individual, noticed this. He called on his men to desist from slaughtering the Purple Mountain Bersaglieri, and they swiftly regrouped. He then led his force in a sudden charge, past the massed ranks of both the Negroni Grenadiers and the Old Boys, straight at Eloise von Schniffelstadt. And he was nearly successful in ending the war there and then, but not quite. Several of her staff officers were cut down, but, accompanied by the remainder, Eloise von Schniffelstadt hastily withdrew to take shelter with the 2nd Battery of the King's Artillery, now limbered and ready to advance. The DRECK Dragoons were hard on her heels. Had the guns of the King's Artillery been unlimbered, they could have fired canister into the onrushing horsemen. This would have been most inconvenient for the cavalry, and would most probably have stopped them in their tracks. But the cannons were limbered and unable to fire, and so the dragoons simply rode over the gun crews. Many of these men were killed as they desperately tried to spike their guns to prevent them being used should they fall into the hands of the enemy. The others ran in all directions or tried to take shelter. Behind the gun crews, Eloise von Schniffelstadt's staff officers formed a defensive group around her and urged her to flee. The Krassenbachers' intervention in favour of Captain Rosenkerl had been a success. It had turned the tide against the 1st Company of the Dreckenbach Jägerkorps. But Captain Schnabel now realised that in doing someone else's work he had neglected his own, and the guns that he was supposed to be protecting were under attack. he attempted to remedy the situation by charging his men into the rear of Captain Romegrot's DRECK dragoons. This intervention was timely. The dragoons turned to meet the Krassenbachers' attack. This allowed the remaining gunners some respite, an opportunity to finish spiking the guns or to withdraw, and, brushing aside the protests of her staff officers and ignoring the whirling cavalry battle taking place not 50 yards from her, Eloise von Schniffelstadt rode forward, up to one of the limbers. "You really are too predictable," she said. "Please come out from under there." Crown Prince Leonardo emerged from under the limber. He looked crumpled and somewhat shamefaced. Eloise von Schniffelstadt turned to her staff officers. "Find him a horse," she said. She gestured at the DRECK dragoons. "Captain Schnabel cannot distract them for long," she observed. "We are going to have to abandon the cannon, and without cannon we are not in a position to win this war today. It is time to withdraw." She was right. Captain Schnabel could not distract them for long. Although his initial charge had shaken the DRECK dragoons, it had not broken them. And the Krassenbachers were outnumbered, and many of them were untrained. The dragoons recovered, and the Krassenbachers were overwhelmed. But they had bought enough time for Eloise von Schniffelstadt and her staff to rejoin the old boys and lead the retreat of her army down the road, back towards Krassenbacher. The Emperor Ulrich let them go. His light cavalry could not take on line infantry, and his line infantry were outnumbered 2-1. He would have to finish the job another day, but it seemed that when that day came he might have some cannon, and that could only be helpful. Thus ended the Battle of ROTZRAGGE.